intact. If you don't have your mind intact, you're going to lose your behind. All right, that's reality. And so these are the things that are important. These are the things that are necessary. And certainly when we have somebody like Dr. Curuthers and others, we not only like to bring them here, but as I say all the time, we have to give a significant contribution, all right, to show our appreciation for their work and their effort. And as we know, we don't believe in nobody coming in charging. I don't believe in that. I don't believe in that, because they don't charge on Sundays. Floyd Flake don't charge nothing, does it? The Butts charge anything? All right? The Wyatt Walker charge anything? All right, they don't charge a thing. And they all doing well, am I right? All right, now just like they can do well, we can also make people like Dr. Curuthers at least have some kind of meaningful existence. All right? Because I'm going to tell you, if Dr. Curuthers was a preacher, all right, if he was a preacher, they would be getting $10,000 for tonight. See, that's what churches do. See, the reason why Vernon Mason ain't no fool, all right, and Colin Moore ain't no fool, all right? All right? They ain't crazy at all. All right? They understand what it takes. And they understand what y'all will do. All right? And this is just as important. All right? Now, what I want first of all on this side, I want to put their hands together as we bring this genius to the stage. Dr. Jacob Curuthers. Let's give Dr. Curuthers a warm round of applause. Dr. Jacob Curuthers.
Not right now, no. Yemhotep, may you come in peace. Welcome, greetings. I'd like to call upon Mother Franklin for permission to continue to speak. Thank you, ma'am. It's good to see you here. I'm very happy to be here, and I thank you so much for inviting me again. I always enjoy coming to the UAM and engaging in the fellowship, the sisterhood, the brotherhood, the familyhood, the ujamaa that I find here. And I would like to commend you, Brother Maddox, and the leadership team of the UAM for the wonderful job you are doing in providing a model for community mobilization. Keep the good work up. I'll spread the news everywhere I go. I would like to bring you greetings and commendations from the organizations that I associate with, from the Center for Inner City Studies, where I teach, from the Kemetic Institute, where I do most of my research, from the Temple of the African Community of Chicago, where we worship, and from the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, where we are about the business of restoring African civilization. That's an organization that every African in the universe should belong to. If you haven't joined us, then make plans to do so, because it is in everybody's interest, every African's interest, to restore African civilization. Right now we are involved in a project we call the African World History Project, which is related to what I'm going to try to talk about this evening. And that project hopefully will be the beginning of a 10-volume work that will explore the entirety of history from an African perspective. And thank you. We feel that that is necessary as a foundation for an African curriculum. So the first volume has been out now for about a year, the preliminary challenge, and if you haven't gotten it, we advise you to get a copy of it. So thank you very much. I would like to talk about truth in world history. And let me begin by reading a few lines. He said to the divine judges, "Judge between truth and falsehood. I am his son. I have come to avenge him." Those lines are from a story that was first published about 3,300 years ago during the time of Ramses II in the Nile Valley. And the story is about the struggle between a personified Mot, that is truth, and a personified Isphet, that is falsehood. The Kemetic people dealt with that theme year after year, the struggle between truth and falsehood. It was always necessary to stress the importance of maintaining Mot, or truth. It was always necessary to stress the importance of overthrowing falsehood, which so often crops up. And so this story, from which those lines were taken, is a sort of allegory, depicting the struggle where falsehood, through trickery, through lying, which is falsehood's main talent, overthrows truth, mutilates truth, throws him into oblivion, and then sets up the dominion of the land based upon what falsehood does, that is based on lies. But the son of falsehood, of truth, discovers the crime and commits himself to avenging his father. And that's what those lines are about. I'm going to return to that story toward the end of my remarks this evening. But those lines, "I am the son of truth. I have come to avenge him," epitomize the life and the work of our master teacher, our elder, my mentor, Dr. John Henry Clark. And these remarks are dedicated to him, and I hope they don't dishonor his outstanding contributions. Because in 1971, when I had my first face-to-face conversation with Dr. Clark, 101, it was because he found it necessary to give me a lecture about truth. I had played lightly with the concept of truth in mocking some speakers who were on a program, and Dr. John Clark stopped me as I was leaving the auditorium and said, "I want to talk to you about truth." And so we spent about 4 hours that evening talking about truth, and Dr. Clark straightened me out. What I would like to do this evening is to first make a brief statement of the problem of African historiography as a preface to exploring truth in world history. After that, I would like to develop an exploratory outline of the history of history in the context of the two cradles that Cheikh Anta Diop provided for us. And then I would like to talk about the revision of African historiography vis-a-vis the first and second comings of Eurasian religions into Africa. And then finally, I want to make a few concluding remarks. And I hope I can do all of that before we all go to sleep. First of all, let us understand that the battle for African history is the battle for truth. It's the battle for the restoration of truth. Let me put this problem in the context of the wisdom of John Henry Clark. John Henry Clark stated his mission, and to use his own words, he said, "I was in pursuit of the definition of the role of that my own people had played in the history of the world. This had been my holy mission, my priesthood." As you probably know, Dr. Clark repeated a proclamation many, many times that Africa and her people had a history older than the history of their oppressors. Contrast John Henry Clark's mission and commitment and life work in the restoration of truth, in the restoration of African history, with the position that Hegel took. Let me read this. I'm sure you've heard it before, but it's a very important statement that the European oppressors of African people did. "At this point, we leave Africa, not to mention it again, for it is not a historical part of the world. It has no movements or developments to exhibit. Historical movements in it, that is, in its northern part, belong to the Asiatic or European world. Carthage displayed there an important transitory phase of civilization, but as a Phoenician colony, it belongs to Asia. Egypt will be considered in reference to its western phase, but it does not belong to the African spirit. What we properly understand by Africa is the unhistorical, undeveloped spirit still involved in the conditions of mere nature and which had to be presented here only as on the threshold of the world's history." Thus, what Hegel proposes in dealing with the African question is that Africa be removed from history. In other words, Hegel commits the crime of historicide, the killing of a people's history, as a solution to the African problem. Because you see, almost 100 years before Hegel made that pronouncement, the European philosophers had conspired to fabricate a doctrine that we now call white supremacy, the doctrine that African people are subhuman and that European people are superhuman. And what Hegel was doing is winding that conspiracy up because it had some problems in its original presentation. One was Nile Valley civilization. And so what Hegel proposed is that the only way we can solve that problem, the only way we can maintain the concept of what he called Negro inferiority, is to deny that the ancient Egyptians were African, and then to deny that ancient Egypt was really in Africa, and then finally to remove Africans from history altogether. Because when you destroy a people's history, you destroy the people. And so that is the problem that we are confronted with. And that's why Professor Clark so often quoted his instructor, Arthur Schomburg, who he said told him, "Black history and African history are the missing pages of world history. Son, go study the history of your masters. Go study the history of Europe. If you understand the history of Europe, you will understand how you got left out of history, who left you out, and why you got left out. You will understand something else, that no oppressor can successfully oppress a consciously historical people, because a consciously historical people would not let it happen. It became a necessity to remove you from history in order to convince you, at least in part, that you are supposed to be oppressed, and to remove from your eyesight every image of endearment, everything that endears you to yourself, so that you can feel that, at least in part, God too has frowned on you and deserted you and put you outside the basis of humanity." That is our instructor repeating the wisdom of his instructor. That's the tradition that John Clark stands in. We understand that those missing pages that Arthur Schomburg was talking about were deleted in order to erase Africa from history. They produced, as a consequence, a mutilated and distorted history that has been used as a weapon against African people for almost 3 centuries now. The warfare started by this atrocity really is an echo of the struggle between truth and falsehood, because that's what it is. The historiography of the Europeans is a falsehood that has temporarily dethroned truth, has temporarily pushed truth to the side. And that evokes Sheikh Anta Diop's two-cradle theory. The idea that there are in this world, there are 2 worldviews. One worldview is based upon aggression and violence and alienation, and the other is based upon peace and harmony. In other words, the European worldview, falsehood, versus the African worldview, truth. And that is what we have to face as we talk about a world history. We are facing the historiography of alienation, which has attempted to cover the whole world, which has attempted to dictate to every discipline that Europeans are supreme and that Africans are inferior. Not only, though, is this European doctrine an alien doctrine to the African way, but it is permeated with alienation. As David Walker pointed out in his appeal in 1829, the whites are not only at war with us, they are at war with themselves. They are at war with their mothers and fathers and their wives and their children. Thus, there are 2 definitions of history. The African definition has been stated many times. Kizerbo, a brother, a historian and scholar from Burkina Faso, puts it this way: history is national memory. And in stating that definition of history, he is echoing the wisdom that comes from the Nile Valley about 4,400 years ago. Tahotep, who Sister Yarba read from, I believe, or somebody read from earlier in the day. Tahotep petitioned his pharaoh to allow him to make an elder staff. He was 110 years old, and he was explaining the function of an elder. And in explaining that function, he said that what an elder is supposed to do is to raise an elder's staff, a cane for the elder to lean on. And that idea of the elder's staff is a double metaphor. In the first place, it refers to the passing generation raising up the coming generation to take its place, and thus the old people lean upon the young people that they install in office. That's one metaphor. But the other metaphor that is conveyed by that expression is the fact that the word for staff or cane in the ancient Kemetic language is madu. The word for speech is also madu. And therefore, the pun stresses that when the elders raise the next generation, they raise the next generation through speech, through good speech, through instruction. And the instruction that they give them is the wisdom of the ancestors from the beginning of time. In other words, what African history really is an intergenerational transmission, where the elders pass on to the juniors the wisdom of the ancestors and command the juniors to do likewise. That is the concept of African history, an intergenerational conversation, which defines what African society is and what African society can become. Indeed, this idea of an intergenerational transmission was the original tradition of all peoples. The question that we have to raise is, why is it necessary to go beyond that? Why is it necessary to go beyond the story that the elders pass on to the next generation? Why do we have to go to what is called a world history? That's what I hope to deal with this evening. Now let us look at the Eurasian concept of history. If you take the Greek historian who is alleged to be the father of history, a man named Herodotus, you find that he uses a word from which the word history is derived. And that word is historia, a Greek word which means the accumulation of knowledge through inquiry. In other words, what this suggests is that the Greek historian is not satisfied with the words of the elder. When the elder tells the Greek historian, tells the Greek student what the ancestors say, according to Herodotus, the student has to question that. The student has to bring that into question. And the way the student deals with the problem is to investigate and find out whether what the elder said was the truth. In other words, a rejection of the intergenerational transmission. The irony of the Greek deviation from this tradition is that Herodotus pointed out that the Egyptians were the best record keepers that he knew anything about. This is the father of history, talking about history. The irony of the situation is that Herodotus praised the Egyptian calendar and said that the Egyptian calendar was the best calendar in the world, much better than the Greek calendar. And so the bases of history that Herodotus used and converted and distorted came from Africa. That is one of the ironies of the situation. Another irony of this European or Eurasian historiography is seen in the fact that Plato, Josephus, Africanus, Eusebius, all of these Eurasian historians used the history that was written by a Greek historian, Manetho, as the basis of their chronological history. And so the Europeans who have developed a contrary notion of history got a whole lot from Africa before they distorted it. Now, let us look at the two historiographies. In Africa, we have what we said was the national memory. That what history is an intergenerational conversation that conveys the national memory. We find that depicted in the chronicles of Egypt, the records that Herodotus was talking about. And one of the chronicles that illustrates it is the one that's up here. I don't know if you can see it too well. You can. Let's see if we can. Can you see it now? You get the general. Okay, some of you who have been to Kemet have seen this. But those of you who haven't, this is the Abydos table. It is in one of the temples that is relatively intact in the Nile Valley. It was built by Seti I, about 1300 BC. And what this particular table shows is the Pharaoh Seti with his son Ramses II. And they are standing before a table with the names of every pharaoh going back to the first pharaoh that united the country, about 2,000 years. In other words, what Seti is telling his son, that is, he is giving his son the wisdom of the ancestors. What he is telling his son is that these are our ancestors, going back for 2,000 years. That gives you an idea of the way Africans look at history. 2,000 years of transmission of the wisdom from generation to generation. You find in all of the texts that deal with serious matters in Kemet, you will find this attention to the history of the wisdom of the ancestors. In other words, that is what Africans consider history, the national memory. And when we turn to Africa, what we may call basic Africa, that is the rest of Africa, we find the same kind of adherence to that intergenerational transmission. One of the outstanding examples can be found in the griot who preserved the tradition of Sundiata. Let me read how he introduced his intergenerational transmission. He said, "I am a jelly." That's the Malian word for griot. "Since time immemorial, the Kuyates have been in the service of the Kaita princes of Mali. We are vessels of speech. We are the repositories which harbor secrets many centuries old. The art of eloquence has no secrets for us. We are the memory of mankind. By the spoken word, we bring to life the deeds and exploits of kings for younger generations. I derive my knowledge from my father, who also got it from his father. History holds no mystery for us. I teach kings the history of their ancestors so that the lives of the ancients might serve as an example, for the world is old, but the future springs from the past. My word is pure and free of all untruth. It is the word of my father. It is the word of my father's father. I will give you my father's word just as I received them, because jellies do not know what lying is. When a quarrel breaks out between tribes, it is we who settle the difference, for we are the depositories of oaths which the ancestors swore. So listen to my word, you who want to know. That is African history. That is the way Africans did history. The problem is why now do we have to deal with the construction of a world history? That's the question that we have to deal with. But this is the basis of our African World History Project that I told you about a little while ago. And that project was inspired by Dr. Clark, Dr. Benyakinen, Dr. Chancellor Williams, and Professor John Jackson. Those were our teachers. They are the ones who showed us the way to do history, to engage upon this project that we are engaged upon. Before I get to that, though, let me just briefly run through the evolution of European historiography, because it's important for us to understand what the enemy has done that causes the problem that we're working on. Because what the European has done from the time of Herodotus and Plato up to the present time is to develop what they call universal history. Universal history. Can you understand the arrogance of that concept? In order to really look at that, let's just go through it very quickly. We talked about Herodotus. When Herodotus opens his histories, he's concerned with the war between the Greeks and the Persians. And what he's wondering is, how did the Greeks come to destroy the Persians, who had such a much larger military force? And he does not trust the explanation that his ancestors gave him. And so he inquires all over the world. The interesting thing is that almost from the start, he goes to Egypt, because Egypt is the place where most of the knowledge is available. And so he goes to Egypt to study with the Egyptians so he can find out about his own history, because he doesn't trust his own intergenerational transmission. Next, we come to Plato. Plato also had a historical problem. Most people don't realize that Plato was interested in history. But Plato was equally dissatisfied with the intergenerational transmission. He didn't believe Homer and Hesiod. He didn't believe that's the way it happened. And he might have had good reason for not believing that. If you read the Iliad, you might agree. But so what he did, rather than to painfully ask all these questions to all these people, what he did was allege that the great thinker before his time, Solon, went to Egypt to find out something about history, to sit at the feet of the Egyptian priest, and the Egyptians then told him about a glorious history of the Greeks that the present-day Greeks knew nothing about. They had forgotten their history. And so what Plato in effect does is to say the solution to the problem of paltry history among the Greeks is to invent a history. And that's what he did, invented a glorious history. And that started a trend in European history that is still dominant today. the invention of a history. Because we have a poor history, we have to invent it. And so it goes. You can follow that trend through Thucydides, through Polybius. Then we come to the post-Greco-Roman era, and we find a man who, ironically, was an African, a man named Augustine, who got romanicized and became a devout Christian and wrote a theology that is the basis of Christian theology today as we understand it, a la the Europeans. And in putting forth that theology, he developed a peculiar historiography. And that is the historiography of mankind. And this is the first comprehensive attempt at a universal history. Because what Augustine pointed out, that mankind is divided into two groups, those who are in the church and those who aren't in the church, those who are in the city of God, the church, and those who are in the city of man. He pointed out that those in the city of man don't have any history. They are at the bottom and are going to remain at the bottom until the end of history. But those in the church have been and are going somewhere. They had a fall at the time of the Garden of Eden, but since that time, since God chose to save a few of them, they have been going up and progressing toward disalienation, reuniting with God. And that is what history is, the progress of that church in time. Now, that idea stayed more or less in the realm of religion for several centuries. But in the modern world, they decided to take it out and secularize it and make it the idea of universal history. You find it first sneaking in the works of Dante. When Dante talked about world government, he was trying to justify the claim of Rome to rule the world. And he used a concept that God intended for the Romans to rule the world. That God had defeated the attempts of all other people before the Romans to rule the world. And that's why God not only allowed the Romans to defeat everybody, but also converted the Romans to Christianity. And so that idea of world history then comes down to earth a little bit. Then, some centuries later, a man named John Locke, who is a kind of idol of the American deep thinkers, because his ideas had so much to do with that document you call the Declaration of Independence. John Locke looked at mankind from the standpoint of development and decided that there were three major stages in the development of human beings. The first stage he called hunting and gathering. The second stage he called subsistence agriculture. And the third stage he called industry. And he pointed out that only the Europeans had arrived at the third stage, which is the highest. And the rest of humanity is still in what he called a state of nature. That is, they're either hunters and gatherers or subsistence farmers. And that is a lower form of human life. And that idea was promoted by another man by the name of Montesquieu. Montesquieu pulled no punches at all. What Montesquieu said is, let's call that first group, the lowest group, savages, and then the middle group, barbarians, and the top group, civilized. And of course, the Europeans are the only ones who have gotten civilized. And because they are civilized and the other groups are retarded, it is necessary for the civilized groups to go down and force those lower groups up the ladder of progress, which means exploitation and enslavement. It was Montesquieu who articulated the need for the development of a doctrine of white supremacy. And here's something he said in regard to his concept about Africa. The greatest part of the people of Africa are savages and barbarians. They are without industry or arts. They have gold in abundance, which they receive immediately from nature. Every civilized state is therefore in a condition to traffic with them to advantage by raising their esteem for things of no value and receiving a very high price in return. In other words, what Montesquieu is doing is justifying the super exploitation of Africa by Europeans. He's saying, in effect, it is because of the Africans' inferiority that we must exploit them, that it's all right to exploit them. And then, in the next century, getting back to Hegel, not only did Hegel exile Africa from history, but he also put together a world history, a universal history, that was divided into three stages. The earliest stage he called the Oriental world, that starts in China. The beginning of history starts in China. And then the middle age was the Greco-Roman age. It goes through adolescence in that part of the world. And then the third and highest stage is the Occidental world or the Western world, where it comes to maturity, and that is the German world. And that history ignores Africa altogether. It is the history of the Western Hemisphere. It is a pure fabrication. To connect the Oriental world up with the European world in that way is a pure fabrication. That's falsehood. That's the way falsehood operates. A brutal history, a history that tears history up, that mutilates history, and then reforms history in the image of the oppressor. That is the historiography of alienation. It is the historiography of those who have created a history, who have made a world conform to their desire to rule and dominate over other people. It's a historiography that has brought warfare generation after generation. It is a historiography that is based upon bloodshed and conquest. It's a historiography that justifies dominion and tyranny. And what the history is designed to do is to rationalize all of those misdeeds. That's what European history is all about, is rationalizing the brutality, rationalizing the oppression. After what happens in the wake of Hegel is that Africans were expelled from history. So Europeans didn't study African history after about 1830. When they wanted to study Africa, they studied anthropology. They relegated Africa to the discipline that studies primitive people, people who haven't yet gotten to the age of mature humanity. They relegated Egypt to archaeology, and therefore you couldn't find Africans in history for almost 100 years. It was only after World War II, really, that the Europeans began to change their mind. They realized at that point that they weren't going to be able to keep Africa out of history forever, and therefore they formed the African Studies Association, ASA. And that's the association that you know John Henry Clark revolted from and started the African Heritage Studies Association because of the colonialism that is inherent in ASA. It is an association where the white professors who want to study Africa colonize naive African students and then divide Africa up and become experts on a divided, mutilated Africa. And they tell us that's African history, ignoring the fact that what African history has been brutalized by is this concept of universal history. And how can Africa respond to that tyranny of universal history divided and segmented up into Eastern Africa and Western Africa and Central Africa and Northern Africa and so forth and so on? But that's what these latter-day historians are attempting to accomplish. And therefore, we have quite a project. African people, since the invasion of Africa by European and Asian ideas and European and Asian military expeditions, African people have had a difficult time dealing with an appropriate history. We can look at that in terms of what I call the first comings and the second comings. I'm talking about the coming of Christianity and Islam into Africa after the fall of Kemet or Egypt. When Christianity first came into Africa, it came peacefully. It came as refugees seeking a hiding place. And they swarmed into Egypt, and they swarmed into Ethiopia, and eventually into the Sudan. And they came in with doctrines that seemed to be very African-like. And that, of course, is understandable because they got so much from Africa in formulating those doctrines in the first place. And therefore, Africans welcomed these refugees in, gave them hospitality, and to a considerable extent, Africanized Christianity. In the first coming, Christianity was considerably Africanized. If you look at what the Ethiopians did when Christianity came in the 4th century, they Africanized it. The Ethiopian church is quite different from the mainstream European churches. If you've ever been in Ethiopia, you can see some of that, especially if you go in the country. They have priests who dance and all things like that. But one of the things that resulted from that contact was a revision of the national memory of the Ethiopian people. They revised it by attempting to connect themselves up with the origin of Christianity. And therefore they connected themselves up with David and Solomon and the people in Israel, of the ancient people in Israel. And that then begins a modification of African history that has come down to today. With Islam, you had the same thing. When Islam first came into the part of Africa that we call Black Africa, it came peacefully. That was the only way it could come. It couldn't bring the jihad in at that point. And so Islam came in, and many Africans converted to Islam. And Islam was considerably Africanized. The Muslims in West Africa behaved a lot differently from the Muslims in Arabia. And many of the Arabian historians remarked on that. They were somewhat alarmed at the fact that Muslim women in West Africa walked in front of their husbands and wore clothes that were not quite appropriate. They wouldn't wear their veils and things like that. And so they were somewhat upset by this Africanized Islam. But again, the intellectuals began to connect themselves up with the age of the prophets. They began to trace their lineages back to Mecca and to trace their travels from Mecca into West Africa. In other words, they revised the national memory so that they could be connected with this new force in the world. And that, again, is a tradition that has come down to us today. But the second comings were different matters altogether. When Christianity came the second time, it didn't come from Asia, it came from Europe. And when it came the second time, it didn't come in as refugees, it came in with the gun. It came in with force. And it was not compromising. It refused to admit African traditions. It fought against and tried to destroy African traditions. It was very intolerant, and it tore Africa up. The second coming of Islam. In the latter part of the 18th and throughout the 19th century, Islam came from through West Africa as jihads. And again, Africans found their traditions under siege and under attack. In other words, in the second comings, the African traditional ways were undermined and became targets of destruction. And that is a part of the problem that we suffer. That's a part of the historical problem that we confront in the 20th and 21st centuries, is how do we recover from that destruction? The European destruction, the European historiography, the Christian destruction, and the Islamic destruction of African traditions. How do we recover from that? That's what we are working on now. That is what we are attempting to do, is to restore the truth, the history. Because the tearing down of African traditions by those invading forces and those invading ideas is the reason we are in the condition we're in now. And that is because falsehood has pushed truth aside, has pushed truth to the side and established its own way. Falsehood has established an artificial world to replace the natural world that Africans are so comfortable in. And that is our problem. That is our mission. Let us return now to the story of truth and falsehood that I started out with. As I pointed out, that story is a personification of the eternal struggle between truth and falsehood through the wisdom of the ancient Kemetic scribes. Ordinarily, in Kemetic literature, Mat is a female divinity. And the literature generally says that we must restore her to her throne. That is, whenever things go wrong, Mat has been dethroned. And therefore it is the duty of everybody, kings, prime ministers, administrators, craftspersons, ordinary farmers, everybody, to restore Mat. And the literature of Kemet is always permeated with that command. But let us look at the story again. The story begins with an accusation by falsehood against truth. Falsehood goes before the 9 great judges of the universe and tells a lie. Falsehood tells the 9 great judges that truth stole my dagger. And it was a very special dagger. The dagger, the blade was made of all the copper in the Copper Mountain. The handle was made of all of the trees in a small forest. The tomb of the king was its scabbard. And all of the cattle in cattle country were used to make the belt. In other words, it was a fabulous dagger. And then falsehood told the 9 judges, therefore, I'm asking that you punish truth. I'm asking that you allow me to blind truth in both eyes and make truth a doorkeeper in my house. And the 9 judges, in view of the fact that there was no contest, ruled it so. And so truth was blinded and set as the doorkeeper in the house of falsehood. But falsehood recognized that every time somebody passed his house, they went up and they gave deference to truth. That even blinded, truth was superior. And so he told his servants, I want you to throw him in the lion's den. And therefore I'll get rid of him. And so the servants took truth away. And they, on the way, truth said, hey, do you really want to do this? And they were too embarrassed and ashamed to consummate it, and so they set him on the side of the road and left him and went back and told falsehood, we threw him to the lions. In the meantime, truth was picked up by the servants of a lady who had a grand house. And when truth was brought in and the lady saw how beautiful he was, she fell in love with him and took him to her bed and got pregnant and had a son. She kept truth as her doorkeeper. When her son, who was an excellent boy, grew up, bright in every respect, remarkable in relationship to all of the other boys in the community, he kept getting taunted by his classmates because his classmates said, you know, you don't have a daddy. Where's your daddy? You know how children do, other children. Where's your daddy? And so finally Truth went, the son of Truth rather, went to his mother and said, Mother, where's my father? And she said, you know that old man who sits by the door? That old blind man who sits by the door? That's your father. And at first the son of Truth was very angry with his mother, but then he went and he talked to his father, and his father told him what had happened. And so the son of Truth decided to avenge his father. And so he got a beautiful cow, a magnificent cow, and he took the cow to the herds of falsehood. And falsehood's shepherd was out tending the cattle of falsehood, and the son of Truth walked up to the shepherd and said, look, I'm going on a journey, and I would like for you to keep my cow until I get back. Would you do that, and I'll pay you? And the shepherd said, certainly. And then Truth, the son of Truth, went on his way. And pretty soon, falsehood came out to observe his thousands of head of cattle. And he looked and he saw this beautiful cow. And he said, I want you to take that cow and slaughter it because I want to eat it. And the shepherd said, but it's not yours. And it belongs to a young man who came here and left it with me, and I can't do that. And falsehood said, nonsense, slaughter the cow. And when he comes back, let him take a couple of my cows. He can pick any one he wants to. And so it was done. And when the son of Truth got back, he asked for his cow. And the shepherd, of course, told him that, you know, you can take any cow you want to. And Truth then took falsehood to court for stealing his cow. But he told the court that my cow was a fabulous cow. That is, its tail was in the delta, and its head was at the first cataract. One of its horns touched the western mountains, and the other horn touched the eastern mountains, and its body covered the whole Nile River. And the judges said, there never was a cow that big. And Truth said, and there never was a dagger as fabulous as the dagger that falsehood got this problem started with. Therefore, judge between truth and falsehood, because I'm his son, and I've come to avenge him. Now, you know, it looks like what we have here is who can tell the biggest lie. But if you look a little deeper and think about it, what is really happening here is that the dagger has a lot of truth in it. Because the dagger is the way of falsehood. It is a metaphor for the method of falsehood, the method of violence, the method of bloodshed. That is, the way to take something over is not only to lie, but then to back the lie up with violence. And so the dagger is a metaphor for falsehood. It is a metaphor for European historiography. The cow is a metaphor for the African way. Everybody who knows anything about Africa knows that in many parts of Africa, cattle represent wealth. Cattle represent, among the Dinka and the Nuer and so forth and so on, sort of represent the spirit of the whole community. Cattle are natural products of nature. They are naturally related to the prosperity of human life. And therefore, cattle symbolize the African way, the peaceful way, the cultivation way. And so what we have here are two metaphors that represent the way of the European and the way of the African. After truth asked for a judgment, falsehood is so arrogant and so certain that he cannot be challenged that he tells the court, I will take an oath that if truth is alive, I shall be blinded in both eyes and be made a doorkeeper in the house of truth. In other words, look at falsehood's position. Falsehood is saying, how can truth be alive after what I did with truth? What did I do to truth? I blinded truth. I slandered truth. And then I had truth executed. I threw him to the lions. And therefore truth could not possibly be alive. That is the arrogance of falsehood, to assume that truth cannot be alive. I mean, think about it. Think about it. After 500 years of the Ma'afa, how can African truth be alive? Think about it. After 400 years of chattel slavery, how can African truth be alive? After 500 years of genocide, after colonialism, after underdevelopment, after 250 years of the doctrine of white supremacy and Negro inferiority, how can African truth possibly be alive? What they tell us is that your God has lost. Our God won. My cow, my dagger has beaten your cow. Therefore, your truth is no longer in existence. But to the shock of falsehood, to the shock of European scholarship, truth was found alive. That's what John Henry Clark was all about. That's what John Henry Clark proved. The truth was still alive. And that's why those words apply to John Henry Clark. Judge between truth and falsehood. I'm his son, and I have come to avenge him. And that's where we are right here in history today. That's where we are. We are demanding that African people judge between truth and falsehood. And it's important because so many of us have been taken over and dazzled by falsehood. So many of us have joined the ranks of falsehood that we who are trying to carry out the wisdom of people like John Clark, we are having a difficult time trying to vindicate truth among our own people, you know? And then we have these people who are really battling us, tooth and nail. I call them the latter-day defenders of Western civilization. And there are two groups of them. One is the group of the European defenders, people like Alan Bloom, Diane Ravitch, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Mary Lefkowitz, and now Stephen Howe, who all of whom are attacking us by every vicious means they can. They are trying to take our, they trying to do what they used to do in the Middle Ages. After they gave a priest his degrees, if he didn't work out right, they would call him back in a ceremony and defrock him. That is, take his degrees away from him. Well, that's what they're trying to do to Lynn Jeffries and Jacob Curuthers and the whole crowd of us now. They're trying to figure out a way to take our degrees away from us. The defenders, the latter-day defenders of Western civilization. They are telling the world that what they are saying has been wiped out. Don't believe it, because it does not exist. That's what they are saying. The truth is gone. And then we have another group, and that is well, I don't want to use that term. Yes, I will. The running dogs. That is the African defenders of Western civilization, who have been given very prestigious positions in academia, who have been paraded in the majority press, not Tony Martin's majority press, but the main line press, who have been given prime time on television, who have been given stipends to write books to defend Western civilization, and who are teaching many of our children in the colleges and universities of this country. In other words, we are fighting a war against not only our enemy, but our brothers and sisters who have been co-opted by our enemy. So we have to understand, in a certain sense, the warfare that they are waging now against us, the defense that they are putting out against us, is a compliment to how successful we have been. The very fact that they put in all this money means but they are still trying to win this battle. Truth is teaching us that the good life that they are offering, the phantom of liberty that they are dancing before the eyes of our people, that good life is poisonous sweet, and we have to continue to let our brothers and sisters know that. But while we are at the peak, while we are looking down the mountain, while we have achieved the pinnacle of victory, let us not make the mistake that we have made so often in the past, and that is to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. That is, so many times we have been almost there, and we say, well, let's compromise. You know, South Africa. You know, they were just about to destroy the enemy in South Africa. And somebody said, hey, let's compromise. Brother Maddox was talking about Haiti. The Haitians in 1791 were almost about to destroy the French. And a few of the leaders said, but let's compromise. And then it took them 13 years of bloodshed to get rid of the enemy because of that setback. So let us not snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. And let us do what John Henry Clark and his associates, Dr. Ben Yakinen and others, have taught us, and that is, let us restore truth to its proper prayer. And as I often conclude, let me recite the end of Bookman's prayer. In 1791, when he organized the Haitian Revolution, he spoke to the major obstacle to their success. And he told them at the end of that prayer, throw away the image of the white man's God who has so often brought down our tears, and listen to liberty, which speaks in all our hearts.
Dr. Jacob Curuthers, let's give him a warm round of applause again. Let him know that we love him and we love the lecture. Dr. Jacob Curuthers.